healing. We are praying for nothing less than a miracle. You're our first child, and the day of your birth couldn't come sooner. Dear Elliot, right now you are 2 months from being born. We just found out that you have trisomy 18, also called Edwards syndrome. Doctors tell us that you won't likely make it to birth. Your mom and I are praying against that. We're praying for healing. We are praying for nothing less than a miracle. You're our first child, and the day of your birth couldn't come sooner. Dear Elliot, you were born today weighing in at 6 pounds. You are already a miracle to us. Your mom is doing well, and it looks like we'll be hanging out here at the hospital a little longer. Dear Elliot, today you turned 11 days old. We are so proud of you. Today we celebrated your 11th birthday. In fact, we do that every day at 4:59, the time you were born. Dear Elliot, we've been home for a week now, so that's why you don't see your nurses anymore. It's great to have you home. Today I think we'll pack up everything and take our first venture out for coffee. Dear Elliot, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're connected to some tubes. The doctors say we have to keep these in so you can get oxygen to breathe. You are also fed through a feeding tube. We feed you every 3 hours, and it takes an hour and a half to do it. We've loved learning how to best take care of you. We love it. Lots of people email, call, and send cards on your behalf. You're well loved. It's 11 at night right now, and my feeding shift has just begun. Mom is asleep, and the best part of my day. My shift ends around 4:45 a.m. when your mom takes over. She cherishes her mornings with her boy. Today you turned 1 month old. I didn't know if I'd ever get to say that. To top off the day, 20 friends showed up at the door for a true surprise birthday party for you. They sang, brought balloons, and a birthday cake. It was beautiful chaos. At 2 a.m. this morning, your feeding tube came out. We had been warned this may happen eventually. We quickly realized we did not have a stethoscope, which was necessary to replace the tube. Since our neighbor was a nurse, I went ahead and knocked on their door at 2:30 a.m. They found their stethoscope, and your mom went to it. After much wrestling, praying, and your tears, the tube was down, and you were able to feed. Just so you know, your mom is my hero. Dear Elliot, you now weigh 7 pounds 3 ounces. You're growing, and your food has been bumped up because of your good appetite. You continue to find new ways to steal our hearts. Dear Elliot, today marks 2 months of your life. Your mom and I are so thankful we know you. We know your face, your noises. We know that bath time and massage are your favorite daily activity. You finally learned how to suck your thumb by yourself. Because of trisomy 18, you were born with clenched fists, and being able to do this is actually quite difficult. Way to go, son. Dear Elliot, we celebrate your birthday every day with a picture. Lately, we've tried to get a bit more creative. Dear Elliot, I realize you can get frustrated with your tubes and your frequent congestion. Please know that your mom and I are doing everything we can to make you comfortable. Dear Elliot, well, you tipped the scales today at 8 pounds 14 ounces. Quite an accomplishment. You also have managed to grow a pretty decent mullet. Dear Elliot, we all got to go to a reunion at the hospital. I've never seen your mom more happy. The joy she felt getting to show off her son can't be described with words. In fact, she compared it to the way a mother would feel when her son becomes president or wins a Heisman or develops a cure for cancer. The logic of medicine says you shouldn't be alive, but you are. You are such a fighter. Dear Elliot, you have now passed the 3-month mark. You also got your first cordless pictures taken today. No feeding tube, oxygen, or stickers. This was no small accomplishment, but we got it done. Have I told you lately that we are so proud of you? Dear Elliot, today you went to be with Jesus. An underdeveloped lung, a heart with a hole in it, and DNA that plays faulty information into each and every cell of your body could not stop God from revealing himself through a child who never uttered a word. Not a pulpit, not a slick presentation, not a best-selling book, but a 6-pound boy with trisomy 18. God found great pleasure to take a lowly thing in the eyes of the world and show truth. At your funeral, we released 99 balloons, each balloon representing a day of your life. How beautiful it was to watch, how quickly they were gone. And so today, we celebrate. Elliot, you are well, and although we miss you more than we can express, we're only separated from you by our time left on earth. See you soon, son, Mom and Dad.
This is Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. And it is a day that can be a difficult day. Just watching that video is difficult. It can be difficult in a number of ways. Some of you here this morning may have been involved in an abortion or encouraging somebody to have one. And you need to understand that the grace of God reaches to every one of us. We're all sinners. We've all done things that dishonor God. Some of you have been through a miscarriage. Some would like to have a child and can't. And this Sanctity of Human Life Sunday is difficult because it's hard for you to fathom that people would actually kill their child when you want one so very much. But the reality of this day and the many years that have passed since 1973 and the Roe v. Wade decision bring us to a sobering Sunday to consider the question that a mother asks her son in Proverbs 31, verse 2. What are you doing, my son? Then she heightens it. What are you doing, son of my womb? Whenever I read that, I always think it's sort of like, remember all the hours of labor that I went through to bring you into this world. Maybe some of your mothers have told you that. And she's saying, what are you doing? What are you doing, son, that I talked to God about before you were ever born? What are you doing? I think that's a significant and an important question that all of us need to ask. And it's interesting that this mother goes on in the verses that follow, verses 3, 4, and 5, to talk to her son about being wise in the way he exercises his character. Self-control as it deals with women and with wine. And then she urges him, as she comes to the end of this saying, to be involved in and with the lives of those who are struggling. And it's in those words, it's in verses 8 and 9 particularly, that I want us to focus, because what we see at the very outset is the world's condition cries out for our involvement. As you and I look around at the world in which we live, and I just put a few of the statistics on the screen, the 57 million babies who have been aborted since that 1973 decision, the fact that a million a year are aborted, and there's something to be thankful in that statistic. In the early 90s, it was 1.6 million a year. It's come down for a lot of factors, including the fact that God's people have spoken up, and we have started things like alternatives here in town, and that's had an impact. But as we look around our world, the reality is that there are still in our world, in our country, people created in God's image who are not valued. And what is happening in our world in the United States today cries out for our involvement. There is a writer by the name of Mary Elizabeth Williams. She wrote in Salon magazine 2 years ago at this time of the year, probably as a response to the emphasis that we put on sanctity of life. She wrote an article in which she said, look, we who are pro-abortion, and she is, have to admit that the child in the womb is a human life. That's a pretty amazing statement for somebody who is pro-abortion to make. But here's what she goes on to say. Here's the complicated reality in which we live. All life is not equal. That's difficult for liberals like me to talk about, lest we wind up looking like death panel loving, kill your grandma and your precious baby stormtroopers. Again, an amazing admission. And then she says this, yet a fetus can be a human life without having the same rights as a woman in whose body it resides. She's the boss. Her life and what is right for her circumstances and her health should automatically trump the rights of the non-autonomous entity inside of her, always. What that's saying is there are people in the womb, created in the image of God, who are not being valued by our culture. James Watson, Nobel laureate, was the man, one of the men who was the discoverer of DNA, writes this, if a child were not declared alive until 3 days after birth, then all parents could be allowed the choice that only a few are given under the present system. The doctor could allow the child to die if the parents so chose and save a lot of misery and suffering. I believe this view is the only rational, compassionate attitude to have. Let the child die, and that's talked about as compassion. That's the world we live in. Michael Tooley, philosophy professor, says that parents should be given, quote, some period of time, such as a week after birth, during which they're allowed to decide whether their child lives or not. Richard Dawkins, well known for being one of the foremost atheists in our world until he now knows better. He stepped into eternity. He tweeted this a couple of years ago. Sadly, many believe an unborn baby, that's the first part. Here's what he tweeted. An unborn baby is less human than a pig. That's the world we live in, folks. Richard Dawkins had still has amazing influence. There's also a philosophy professor who is the head of the philosophy department at Princeton University, Peter Singer, who has written this, surely there will be some non-human animals whose lives by any standard are more valuable than the lives of some humans. Killing a defective infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person, he writes. And he's teaching people ethics. That's our culture. There are people in our culture. They're created in the image of God who are not valued. And we're talking especially today about the unborn, but this goes to the other end of life spectrum as well for those who have aged to the point where people would look at them and say, well, there's a life that's not worth living. And it's been interesting. Peggy and I were talking a few weeks ago as we walk this path with my parents, as their ability to do things and their health declines. And if I didn't believe that God created man in his image, then I could maybe look at a person, I could look at my parents and say, you know what? this is not how they would want to be. Let's just usher them out of life. But when we believe that God creates life, that God gives life, that He is the author and He is the one who determines the end of life, then that's not an option. Then we look at every person, whatever their condition, in the womb, out of the womb, on a sick bed, with disabilities, we look at them and they say, God has a purpose and a reason for them. Elliot Mooney, 99 days, that's all he lived. Most of the world would have looked at him and said, there is no point to his life. But look at how the message of his life has spoken beyond the impact of those 99 days. And so, this mother says these words in verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Open your mouth for people who are mute, people who cannot speak for themselves. There is no class of people that is more true of than the unborn. A child in the womb has no voice. They cannot speak for themselves. So we have been placed here to be their voice, to speak for them. It talks about the rights of those who are destitute, and I like the ESV. It's a good translation, but I don't think here they've captured the meaning of that word. Actually, I think what the King James did originally is a better reading. Those who are appointed to destruction. Open your mouth for those who are appointed to destruction. The unborn, the aging, those who are in danger of euthanasia. There are people who, for whatever reason, are doomed. They cannot stop their destruction. Therefore, it becomes our responsibility to speak out for them. And he talks about even the rights of the poor, or she talks about the rights of the poor and the needy. That's another area that we ought to be concerned about. It goes beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today in Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. But certainly when we talk about what is happening in our world, when we talk about the fact that there are people created in God's image who are not valued, that covers a wide range of people in our world. And the truth is that you and I can't be involved in every cause. But we can be involved where God has called us to be. And not only are there people who are not valued, but you see, you and I are in a position to do something about that. That's part of what is being said in these verses as we look at them. That you and I, living here in this country at this time, have an ability to do something. Back up to the beginning of this chapter, and we'll find out who it is that's speaking. I've referenced it as a mother, but notice whose mother? The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? These words are addressed originally to a king named Lemuel. We don't know of any king in Scripture named Lemuel. A lot of people suggest it was a nickname or another name for Solomon, and this is Bathsheba speaking to him. We don't know that for sure. But she was speaking to someone who had an ability to do something. Now, none of us in this room, at least as far as I'm aware, are kings. We aren't royalty. But you know what? We are citizens of a country in which we have enormous rights, where we have the ability to do things that many people in the world only dream of. We live in a country where we have power as citizens, power to petition our leaders, to address situations that we see are wrong, power to write letters, power to vote. And we can get involved with pro-life organizations and causes without anybody coming down on us or persecuting us for it. We can get involved with alternatives of Kalamazoo. Their bulletin insert is in your bulletin and talks about Sanctity of Life Sunday, but their contact information is on the back as well. And we're doing a baby shower. That's a way of being involved. You could give some things to that shower to help women who are going through a crisis pregnancy situation through alternatives. You could volunteer to help them in behind-the-scenes work or get trained to be a volunteer counselor with them. We as a church also support an organization called Life Matters Worldwide. It used to be called Baptists for Life, and they're just up the road in Grand Rapids, and you could get involved with them. There are inserts out in the lobby about their ministry as well. Kalamazoo has a Right to Life. You could get involved with the gospel mission and help at that end of the spectrum. But the point is that we, as God's people, have the ability to be involved. Like King Lemuel had the ability to do something. We have that ability as well. And while we can't be involved in every issue, we can be involved in some way. Your way may be, you say, well, I can only pray. Well, not only. Every one of these organizations need prayer. Every one of our leaders need prayer. Even those who are not pro-life need prayer that God will change their hearts and cause them to come to see the value of human life. This is a Sunday that can be uncomfortable, not just because of the reasons I talked about before, but sometimes people look at this and they say, well, this is a political issue. You're dabbling in politics. No, I'm not. This is an issue that has political ramifications, absolutely. But this is, at its heart, a moral issue. This is about God-given life. This is about you and me who are image bearers of God and how we interact with and treat other image bearers of God. To stand against abortion and euthanasia, to cause our culture to understand that infanticide and those things are not simply something that is our opinion, it is the value of human life given by God. We have made such great strides technologically in medicine, and one of the things that we can do now is look inside the womb, and that's been good because it's allowed us to see that this is not a blob of tissue. This is a person. But some of those advances have allowed us to know what that child in the womb is like before he or she is born. And tests are run, and we find out whether they're going to have some kind of a disability. Did you know that the test that's run for Down syndrome has resulted in 9 out of 10 Down syndrome babies now being aborted? 9 out of 10, 90%. Thank God that's not true in this body. We have some of those precious children here. And they are God's gift not just to their families, but to us as a body. To remind us that every person, every child has God-given worth and value. And God has given them something that we don't have to remind us of all kinds of truths. But our culture doesn't get that. All human life has value. That ripples out across all kinds of things, not just talking about poverty. That talks about the way we treat people who are of other skin colors and other languages, because it doesn't matter what that language is or skin color. We're all created in the image of God. And we have a responsibility in our culture. We can't influence other cultures necessarily. We can't go back in time and change things, but we can work where we are now. We're in a position to do something. The world's condition cries out for our involvement. And as we look at these verses in this passage, God's word commands our involvement. And again, not involvement in every issue and not involvement perhaps in ways others are involved, but in some way. See, it's not just the circumstances around us that should drive us to be involved. It's also the God who commands, who demands us. You probably noticed in verses 30 or 8 and 9 of chapter 31 that we're ordered to speak up. We're ordered to speak up and to stand up, to take verbal action and physical action. Look again at verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth. Repeated twice. The command to speak up for the speechless. And that will rarely be popular in our culture. We live in a very politically correct culture today, and it's not politically correct to talk about things like this or to challenge people's views on it. Over the years, as I have spoken on this Sunday or other times about this issue, I've had people say, well, you're going to drive people away from church, and maybe it has. I don't know. I can't help that. We're called, we're commanded to speak for those who can't speak. Over the years, in my ministry, I've had high school and even junior high students who have said, I want to write something about that for my speech class or my English class. And so I helped them get some information. And that doesn't always go over real well. But that's okay. The verse doesn't say speak up as long as people like what you say. It says speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. They can't, so we have to. And we're commanded to judge righteously, to defend the rights of those who have no influence. And remember, she's speaking to her son who's king. And kings often tend to gravitate to do things for people, kind of like politicians today, to do people who can do things for them. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But this command is to do something for those who can't do anything for you. In fact, they can't do much for themselves. And so they need you. Name that has become more known since the Amazing Grace movie came out a few years ago. William Wilberforce worked for over 40 years to end the slave traffic in England and in the British Empire. It only ultimately came to an end when he was on his deathbed. And he poured out his life. And I look at that and I think about his life and I think, would to God we had had somebody like that in the United States who would have taken that stand than we did. But here's what Wilberforce said. He was vilified for what he did. But he says, never, never will we desist till we extinguish every trace of this bloody traffic, of which our posterity, looking back to the history of those enlightened times, will scarce believe that it has been suffered to exist so long a disgrace and dishonor to this country. And I read that quote and I thought, wow, that applies to abortion. That applies to infanticide. That applies to euthanasia. And I wonder if God in His grace and mercy does bring about a change in thinking in our country, if 50 years down the road our grandchildren and great-grandchildren won't look back and say, how in the world could they do that? And where were God's people in the middle of that? And thank God they'll be able to look at some of God's people who've stood up like a Wilberforce and said, this is wrong. And who began places like Alternatives of Kalamazoo and ministries like Life Matters Worldwide and said, this is wrong. Because we as God's people are commanded by God to stand up, to speak up. And we have the opportunity to work and to pray and to advocate for justice in our land because of the position God has given to us as citizens of this great country. We are ordered to speak up and stand up, and that means we can't gloss over the problem. It would be so much easier to stick our heads in the sand and ignore what happens in our country. It would be so much easier to say, well, that's just the way it is, but we can't do that. Lemuel's mother has just talked to him about the dangers of wine and how he shouldn't drink it. And then she says some words that I think over the years have been misinterpreted in verses 6 and 7. You've got to understand, I think what she's doing here is sarcasm. What she's saying is, you shouldn't drink as king because it will distort your judgment. But here's the good of alcohol. Give strong drink to the one who's perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. In other words, use it as an anesthetic. Sort of like when you go to the mechanic and he says, well, your muffler's really loud, but just turn the radio up and it won't hurt anything. That's kind of the view. Lemuel's mom is saying, look, if you don't get involved in these causes, then just give them alcohol. Just give them something to numb their pain and let them go on their way. And then she says, no, you need to speak up and stand up. Somebody is perishing. They're ruined. They're dying. They're in bitter distress. They're discouraged. They're depressed. They're poor and needy in financial trouble. Don't just gloss over it. Don't just dull their pain so they won't notice. And that's really what our culture does. Our culture says to a woman, well, you have this crisis pregnancy. You have some reason why this is difficult. Well, here, we'll help you by killing your baby. We'll anesthetize this situation instead of saying, what's at the root of the issue? Why is this baby a problem for you? Is it because you're single? Then you need to think about abstinence. Is it because you think you have too many children? Then you need to be rethinking how you view children. Instead of saying, well, let's just get rid of the problem. If you're poor, let's just throw some government money at you. Instead of saying, why are you struggling with those needs? How can we help you to take a step up out of that? Instead of taking the easy way out, instead of glossing over the situation, instead of all of that, God says, speak up and stand up and get involved. And involvement takes all kinds of forms. For those of you who are parents of younger children, then you need to be involved in teaching them, the next generation, the value of life. That people, even if they're different from you, that people, even if they have some kind of a mental or physical disability, or their skin color is different, or something else is different, they still are valuable in the eyes of God, and they ought to be valuable to you. Encourage those of you with younger children, when you can, take them to visit people who are older. Help them to get to know that people who are older aren't just people who don't get around as well anymore and have gray hair and parts they can take in and out of their body. Help them to know that these are people with wisdom and experience and value in life. And as they grow up, they'll say, you know what? Grandma and Grandpa may not be able to throw the ball around anymore. They may not be able to do some of those things. But boy, I love to talk to them and hear how the experience is their life. Volunteer in places where life is cheap, where life is threatened. Work with alternatives. Take part in the shower. Vote for life. Know where your candidates stand before you vote. Work in somebody's campaign. Some of you in here and in connections or watching online, you ought to get involved in politics. You ought to run for office. So that maybe down the road you can be a pro-life candidate for Congress or Senate or president. That some of us can say, I can vote for that person because they're a person who understands the value of God-given life. Most of all, at the heart of all of this, and you understand this, but we need to say it. At the heart of all of this is the gospel, because it ultimately isn't just about physical life. If physical life is all there is, then what happens in this life really doesn't matter that much, though it is still given by God. But physical life isn't all there is. There's spiritual life. And the reality is what's going on in our culture will not ultimately change through changing of laws and lobbying politicians and even having places like alternatives or right to life. They all are important. Don't think I'm downplaying that. But ultimately, the only thing that'll change our culture is a change of heart in our culture. And that comes when the power of the gospel is brought to bear on individual lives. So that's where we start. And that's why I love ministries like Alternatives, because they're not just about convincing women to carry their baby to term and helping them to do that and providing resources. They're also about sharing the gospel with them so that there can be heart change and life change in those situations. So the real question is the one that we started with. What are we doing? Which is a question that comes right out of the text, where Lemuel's mother says, what are you doing? And then she tells us that the conditions in the world around us cry out for us to be involved. That's not enough for us, then this book commands us to be involved with people. But ultimately, we've got to bring it all back to the cross. We really do. Because if you are here or you are watching and you have had an abortion, as I said at the beginning, the cross is where you need to go. Because that's where forgiveness is for any of us who are sinners, which is all of us. And it's the cross that we need to run to for forgiveness if we've been one of the people who haven't stood, we haven't been engaged, we haven't been involved. And say, God, forgive me and show me what I can do in my little piece of involvement. Or maybe we haven't really valued life, or we haven't valued people who are different from us. And we haven't seen the God-given value of people whose skin color or language or abilities are different than ours. And we go to the cross for forgiveness and restoration. It's also where we go for the power to do what we've been talking about today. To be involved as we're called to by our culture and by our God. Because that involvement, if it comes just out of a motivation of my heart or your heart, will end up disappearing after a while. And even if it's rooted in the gospel and it's rooted in the cross, it's still tough. I've been involved in the pro-life movement in some way for about 30 years, and there are times when it just gets really wearying to be fighting that battle again and again and again. And there have been times when I've backed off a little, and I don't think that's always wrong. You can back off a little and then re-energize and go back. But it's ultimately understanding that God loved me enough to give his son for me on the cross that motivates me to love other people and to share the gospel with them and to get involved in standing for life. It's only the cross that keeps us from getting angry and bitter when we see life not being valued. When we see people saying things like some of those quotes I read earlier, it's only the cross that reminds us, you know what, except for God's grace, that would be me saying things like that. If it weren't for God's grace in forgiving my sin and drawing me to Christ, I could have been one of those people standing up and shouting that abortion and infanticide and euthanasia are just fine. It's not because I'm so smart or so much better than they are. It's because of the cross. That's why we need to come back to it. And we need to come back to the question that Lemuel's mother asks us, what are we doing? One of the men who is considered to be one of the stronger witnesses against what went on in Nazi Germany wrote these words about his response in the early days of that anti-life culture. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up. Powerful statement that, along with King Lemuel's mother's words, challenge us to be involved in our culture, standing up for the value and the sanctity of God-given human life. And we are going to sing, both here and in Connections, after I pray, a song that is a song of challenge for us as a church, for the Church of God worldwide to stand. We have brothers and sisters in Christ who are suffering. Just read this morning a news story about what's going on in Niger and the churches that are being burned and Christians who are being killed. That's part of all of this as well. There is something that resonates in your heart because God has put it there. And he wants you to pray, to write, to give, to volunteer, to be involved in some way in supporting the value of image bearers of God. Let's pray. And so, Father, as we come to the end of a sobering service, a heavy service in many ways, the call of your word and the call of what we're going to utter with our lips is that we would arise and not stand in our own strength, but in the power of the cross, in the power of Christ. And that we would engage our culture with the love of Christ in whatever situations you have put us. Father, if there's anyone here or in connections or watching who they don't even understand the love of Christ because they've never come to Christ for salvation. Though that hasn't been the thrust today of the message, may your Spirit impress their need upon them, and may they speak to someone even before they leave today. Father, we pray for our country. The blood of 57 million babies cries out to you. It is only your mercy that has spared us judgment that we deserve. We ask that your mercy would continue, that your grace would stir your people, and that we might see a change in the culture of our country, from our president all the way down to those who perform and assist in abortions. May hearts and lives be changed. May life be valued again in the United States of America, we pray, as we, your people, arise. In our Savior's name.